Syria preferred to wait for after the elections in Turkey in order to see what's going to happen and who is the new government, if Erdogan is going to stay or is going to be replaced by his opposition. However, the allies of Syria, and namely Moscow and Tehran, they sent their wishes to Damascus that it would be good for the foreign minister of Syria to meet with his Turkish counterpart in order to give an electoral push for Erdogan. This is not the interest or the wish of Syria. This is the wish of Moscow and Tehran. And the Syrian side doesn't want to go against the interests of its allies. The allies of Syria were they have protected the interests of Syria, and now Syria is trying to protect the interests of its allies in the region. It's pretty obvious that Iran and Russia prefer Erdogan over its opposition candidate, and therefore they wanted to give a symbolic push for Erdogan by this meeting in order to say that it's Erdogan who can solve these issues in Syria. We have so many conflicts and crises happening in Syria, and it's Erdogan who can solve this. For example, we have the refugee crisis, 3.5 million Syrian refugees. How are they going to go back to Syria? Who is going to send them? And who is going to receive them in Syria if there is no authority in the north or in Idlib? And speaking of Idlib, how is the situation in Idlib going to be stabilized again? What's the fate of Al-Qaeda and other radical jihadists in Idlib? And also, what's going to happen to the Kurdish militias on the borders with Turkey? So the situation is win-win in my opinion. If they agree, both Turkey and Syria, to normalize their relations, Syria is willing to accept 3.5 million refugees back to Syria. And Syria is willing to push the Kurdish militias away, 30 kilometers away from the borders. But at the same time, it expects from Turkey to withdraw from Idlib and also disarm these radical jihadists in Idlib and in the north. So if you combine these both sides, you see that this is a win-win situation. But Damascus still prefers to see what's going to happen after the elections, while the allies of Syria wanted for Syria to play some minor role as an electoral push for Erdogan before the upcoming election in Turkey. Erdogan's rule in Turkey is like a cycle. At the beginning, especially the first decade, his policy was more focused on economic growth, and at the same time, he pursued the foreign policy under his former foreign minister, Davutoglu, who said zero problems with the neighbors. So zero problems with the neighbors and economic growth led to a strong Turkish economy. And that's why the vast majority of the middle class and the poor voted for Erdogan and then re-elected him multiple times. That was the main reason. Economic stability and regional geopolitical stability in the region. People witnessed that their financial status has been uplifted by Erdogan. That's why he was their favorite candidate. But when Turkey became strong, it has now a strong economic power, it started to project this might and power on the region and started to talk about colonial policies. And it was Erdogan and his Davutoglu foreign minister also, they were speaking about new Ottoman dreams and new Ottoman empire in the region. And they were even naming Aleppo, northern Syria, Mosul in Iraq. So this region, which Turkey was part of the stabilization process for this region, they moved from zero problems with the neighbors into no friendships with the region. They have had bad relations with Syria, they have had bad relations with Iraq, and they've had bad relations with Armenia, and then they sent fighters to Nagorno-Karabakh, for example. In Libya, in Egypt, they've had problems with everyone. So this was the reason why the economic situation started to deteriorate in the region, because when you start to project your power in the region, you are spending more money and investment in regional countries over political projects and illusions or fantasies that you want to establish a new Ottoman empire again in the region. And this was why lots of people in Turkey nowadays, they prefer to see an alternative to Erdogan, because they have tried him for 1 decade. He has really ruled in a well manner and he presented lots of economic development and welfare for the people. But the last decade was catastrophic for the people in Turkey. And that's why nowadays we can see that his popularity has diminished, and even his the rivals of Erdogan are scoring better points in recent polls in the upcoming elections in Turkey. During times of economic crisis, psychologically speaking, people tend to vote for a party or a candidate who was not responsible for the economic misery in this country. We have seen this, for example, in Europe. Many countries elected right-wing groups, for example, in their countries because of economic reasons. And the same thing now applies in the United States. If you ask Americans, especially in the African, Hispanic, and Latino, for example, communities about Trump, they say they want to vote for Trump, many of them, because he uplifted their financial status and he created job opportunities. This is the key. And I think this is why many people in Turkey nowadays prefer the alternative, his rival for Erdogan, because he wasn't responsible for this economic misery. But also there is another reason that may be possible, and that is the NATO support for the opponents of Erdogan. And here we can remember what the meine Güte. And here we can remember what the Interior Minister of Turkey said a few days ago. He accused the United States of interference in the domestic affairs, in the electoral affairs of Turkey. And he mentioned that the American ambassador in Ankara, he met with the opponent of Erdogan in this regard. If this is true, and I do not rule out that possibility, because in the past 4 to 5 years, Erdogan tried to balance his relations between the United States and Russia. And Turkey is too important for NATO to be in the middle. They want Turkey to be on the side of the United States, and especially after the crisis in Ukraine, because Ukraine is an existential war for the United States empire. And having powers such as Saudi Arabia, such as the United Arab Emirates, such as India, such as Pakistan, such as Turkey, who is standing in the middle, this harms the foreign policy approach and the strategy of the United States, because they want a decisive victory over Russia in Ukraine. And when these players are hesitant to play along the US empire, which if we see the cycle of any empire, we realize that the United States is already in the last third of its empire time. So these countries are trying to find alternatives. They are pursuing better relations with China and Russia. And also, most importantly, they're talking about and planning for the de-dollarization of their economies. And this will be the last, in my opinion, nail in the coffin of the American empire if these countries ditch the dollar and start adopting the Chinese yuan. It's hard to predict the foreign policy approach of any candidate, because what they say during the electoral campaign may be different when they come to power. And there are so many examples of that, because there's so many calculations that they have to check with the military, with the MIT, for example, the intelligence apparatuses in Turkey before pursuing any foreign policies in the region. However, Kılıçdaroğlu, if we see his statements, he is very clear in his approach, for example, towards Syria. He wants to restore diplomatic ties with Syria. And I would not rule out the possibility that the first country that Kılıçdaroğlu, if he's elected, the first country that he might visit, it would be Damascus, it would be Syria. Because the priority for them is they have 3.5 million refugees, and this represents a huge economic burden on their shoulders, and they want an authority in Syria to deal with it, right? Because you cannot just send 3.5 million refugees to Syria and there is no authority receiving them, preparing housing, and also humane treatment, because remember Assad in the past few months, he issued, for example, a presidential pardon for anyone who supported terrorism, whether financially or verbally, or he participated in any terroristic act, in exception for people who killed or murdered people. Therefore, this was the first step, or the positive signal from the Damascus side, that they're willing to receive the refugees, even if, for example, they were activists or they were journalists working alongside any sort of terrorist organization or trying to polish their reputation there. So what Kılıçdaroğlu says now It's positive and it's welcomed for Syria, but there is also the possibility that Erdogan might be re-elected, and if he is re-elected, we will see that Russia and Iran, they will play a mediator role, and they will try to pursue balanced foreign policy between Damascus and Ankara.